Hello, everybody. My name is Rahim Shakbayev, and I'm really honored to be a moderator of the first session. And I'm welcoming you to the CAMCA Regional Forum. The title of our session is Economic Prospects of the CAMCA Region. And today we have a particularly respected and popular economist in our CAMCA region, Professor of Economics at the Paris School of Political Science, Dr. Sергei Guriev. Dr. Guriev, I'm happy to see you again. Thank you for being with us. And I think that Sергei Maratovich is notable for being one of the main popularizers or promoter of both economic science and liberal values in the post-Soviet space. He is one of the few representatives of economic science who empathetically builds the relationship between the design of the political system and economic growth. And we have discussions about this many times. And I think also everybody knows about the career of Sергei Maratovich. He was the rector of the very prestigious and famous Russian Economic School and the chief economist of the EBRD. And we were all happy when he returns to the public space and began to express his point of view, not burdened by the ethics of the international bureaucracy. Sergei Maratovich, so I think the first question certainly be relevant with regard to the strategies for dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. We in our region are seriously concerned about the third wave of growth in the incidence of the so-called Indian variant of coronavirus, which we are seeing in Russia. A daily record of infections has been recorded for the entire time of the pandemic. There are many cases of both reinfection and those previously vaccinated. Just my friend, he got through the coronavirus last year, and he got the second vaccine on end of the May, and now he's here in Nur-Sultan. He infected by coronavirus again. We see that the Kremlin and Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin called for revaccination against the background of the fact that the rate of the vaccination, despite its availability, is not high enough. And observers have raised concerns about hopes that even the availability of vaccine will not be a panacea for pandemic. And what conclusions and lessons can be drawn regarding an effective strategy to fight coronavirus for the countries in our region, in our CAMCA region? How do you feel about the compulsory vaccination?
Thank you very much, Rahim. It's a pleasure and honor to speak here at CAMCA Forum. And thank you very much, Rahim, for arranging this session, as well as I would like to thank Rumsfeld Foundation and David Sumbadze. Regarding the question on coronavirus, I think we are in a situation of a great uncertainty. We don't know a lot of things. And indeed, we only see that the virus reinvents itself. And so things which were certain yesterday may be wrong today. And one of those things, as you rightly mentioned, is the Indian variant of the virus, which seems to be more contagious, possibly less lethal, but this is something that we've not observed yet, even if you have vaccination by vaccines such as AstraZeneca or Sputnik. Now, what is overall approach to fighting COVID? So in the first wave, when we have limited knowledge, many countries reacted with lockdowns simply to prevent the overburdening of the hospitals. This is a normal reaction in any epidemiological policy making, because what you need to do, you need to spread the shock in the SIR model or other versions of models with infectious diseases. And so lockdown makes sense. Now, if you want people to stay at home, of course, you need to pay them somehow. People, especially middle-income countries, have limited savings. And so many countries have been reasonably generous to support business, support employment. In some countries, support unemployed. In some countries, just giving money unconditionally to people just to make sure that people stay at home and don't spread the disease. That could have bought time, and indeed in many countries that did buy time to develop vaccines and start producing vaccines. And today we see that many countries are actually reopening. And so I'm in France today. it looks like that by September 1st, France will vaccinate everybody, at least all adults and even some teenagers, many teenagers, as a matter of fact, and will be able to return to normal, unless it turns out that the new variants actually are more dangerous than vaccine developers think. And this is something that we don't really know. So that would be the optimal reaction. Reasonably tight restrictions, generous financial fiscal support that probably results in very high debt burden in the future. Today, we see that because of coronavirus, European countries will see increase in debt to GDP ratio by about 14 percentage points. It's huge. Then after all, just producing vaccines, relying on vaccines, and maintaining masks, because we should remember that vaccines don't provide 100% protection. So a lot of people now are worried that Indian variant actually kicks through vaccines. And you mentioned Russia. In Russia and in Moscow in particular, currently the situation is actually extremely dangerous. One of the problems in Russia, and I can talk more about that, is lack of trust in vaccination. And so part of the problem right now is that this trust is sinking further because people who've been vaccinated actually are worried that this vaccine doesn't stop the new variant. That is something that we don't know, but think about this. If vaccine has 95% efficacy, does that mean that you're fully protected? No, you're only protected 19 times out of 20. And if you have 100 more contacts with the infected, you're more likely to be infected yourself, even if you're vaccinated. And that, of course, creates additional risks. There are two risks here. One is lower trust in vaccine, even lower trust in vaccine, as people see that people who've been vaccinated still get infected and get sick. And second, because the variant keeps changing. And instead of Indian variant, we may actually get a Russian variant, which will also be resistant to vaccines like Sputnik. So it's all extremely dangerous. When you ask about compulsory vaccination in a country with low trust in vaccines, I think it may be even more dangerous in the sense that when people see vaccine being imposed on them, they would further reduce their trust in vaccine. And furthermore, as we see in countries with high level of corruption, you can end up with a situation where you're required to produce a vaccination certificate and you produce a fake vaccination certificate which you buy from doctors or from authorities. So whatever you do now, things are not great. And I would just like to say to everybody who's listening, even Sputnik, which may be less effective against Indian variant, does seem to work. And so if you have access to Sputnik or to Sinovac, whatever vaccines that are not sometimes said to be effective, still vaccinate yourself, because that increases your protection, definitely increases chances to have a non-symptomatic or a lighter version of COVID if you get infected. So this is a situation where we should all be worried. And when people say that the Western countries have so far done well, even that is not should not be taken for granted, because new variants can actually get through the protection provided even by more advanced vaccines. So we should all be worried. But at least what we see in the US and in Europe now suggests that policy, being a very expensive policy with, as I said, spending 10 or 15 or 20% of GDP, that policy may work and may bring back both health and economic activity. And this is what we are seeing now in Europe and the United States. In middle-income countries, as you said, sometimes countries don't have enough cash. And this is where organizations like World Bank and IMF should help. Country clubs such as G7 and G20 should have, and producers of vaccines should roll out voluntary licensing to produce more vaccines and provide them in some form to developing countries, and I hope it's going to happen. We just saw new commitments coming from G7 leaders to provide vaccines to developing countries. But countries which are like Russia and Kazakhstan, which have large sovereign wealth funds, should spend them. This money was saved for the rainy day. This is the rainy day. People are dying and economic activity is suffering. And the way out of it is restrictions, plus generous support of people in the economy, plus buying vaccines, plus providing incentives to vaccinate. So that's where we are.
Thank you, Sергei Maratович. Let me remind to the participants that they can send the questions to the Q&A box. So we have 45 minutes in our session. In 30 minutes, I hope we will end our discussion, and we will leave 15 minutes for answering the questions from the participants. Sergei Maratович, my second question about inequality. So 1.5 years, we have a coronavirus pandemic, and we see that inequality is definitely increasing worldwide, both between countries in different stages of development and as well as within countries, between people. So inequality in both income inequality and inequality of opportunities. And the country of CAMCA region, which are definitely the third world, we are on the trajectory of the catching up development. Our political system is far from the most effective political systems, and we are not we don't have the most developed human capital, countries with the trade deficits, so on and so forth. And we are particularly affected by inequality, which is growing definitely. What recipes can be promoted to our government to better handle with inequality in case of the CAMCA region countries?
As Leo Tolstoy said in the opening phrase of Anna Karenina, all happy families are alike, and each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And I think that cannot be one size fits all recommendation to solve this big problem. As you rightly said, this problem gets especially painful. It gets aggravated by COVID. If you think about COVID, people occasionally say it's a great leveler, because the virus cannot distinguish between the rich and the poor. This is not exactly true. Why? Because, well, actually richer people have better health and as such have better chances to survive. But moreover, they have more square meters, they have better internet connections, their jobs are more likely to be doable online, they have savings. And in all those respects, they are having a better time during this disaster than people who have no savings, who have smaller apartments, less internet connections, and whose jobs are manual jobs related to contacting other people. So it's much harder to keep social distancing. So inequality can be increased. And as I mentioned, in richer countries, governments understood that and actually learned from the previous crisis, from the global financial crisis 2008, 2009, and decided to be generous and to support people left behind, and have done that to a great extent. And as I said, this is the rainy day, and inequality is especially painful. And every country that can borrow or can spend sovereign wealth fund should try to help those left behind. So this is my piece of advice during the pandemic. The longer term piece of advice is, of course, in order to reduce inequality, you need investment in human capital, accessibility of human capital, you need infrastructure, connectivity of countries and markets. You need to make sure that people, wherever they're born, have access to digital infrastructure, to transportation infrastructure, and to good schools, hospitals, and universities. And that's the only way you can reduce inequality. And in normal times, the good news is there are many international partners that can help investment in human capital and infrastructure. The problem is that during COVID, borders are more or less closed, so situation is not that easy. But overall, that's the solution: human capital and infrastructure, being it physical or digital infrastructure.
Thank you, Sergei Maratович. You, one of the co-authors of the next report, Stagnation 2, Consequences, Risks, and Alternatives for the Russian Economy. And your article was about the middle income trap. I think many economists and especially decision makers have heard about this concept many times, but don't fully understand it. You write that in your article that the middle income trap is a situation where the institutions that have contributed to rapid growth in the country, moving from low to middle income, become a brake on further development. And what economic indicators can indicate that the country has fallen into the trap? GDP per capita, growth dynamics, or something else? Is the average income trap specific to each country in terms of numbers? Because your interpretation is rather that the political system is not conducive to economic growth. For which countries of the CAMCA region is the agenda more relevant, and what strategies can be used to break out from this trap?
Thank you, Rahim. Indeed, in this book, we discuss the situation in which Russia finds itself now after 10 years of very slow economic growth and probably facing another decade of slow economic growth. This was completely predictable 10 years ago. Actually, more than 10 years ago, my co-author Oleg Tsavinsky and myself, we wrote a chapter and a number of op-eds about the risks of what we called 70-80 scenario for Russia, where 70-80 was a punt on the oil price staying in this 70-80 region, but also coming back to 70s and 80s, 1970s and 1980s of Brezhnev's Soviet Union or economic stagnation. We also pointed to 70 or 80% approval ratings of Mr. Putin. And that scenario was fully implemented. Unfortunately, Russia has not fallen apart. Russia withstood major challenges, major economic challenges, but now is stagnating. And this is a typical middle income trap, as you rightly said. So the middle income trap is something that was described by two World Bank economists, Indermit Gill and Homi Karash, in mid-2000s, where they argued that many economies which were quite successful moving from low income to middle income suddenly started to lose steam and stopped to catch up with the advanced economies. And actually, it's not a global rule. And further research showed that there are many countries which got out of middle income trap and became rich countries. And in our region, that would be, for example, Central European countries such as Poland or Czech Republic or Baltic states. But there are many, many examples of middle income trap. Now, there is no one single threshold. Usually people talk about 40 to 70% of US per capita level, or more likely OECD per capita level of GDP. If you're stuck in this region and you cannot breach this 70% level of OECD GDP per capita threshold, that's where you're in middle income trap. But there is no one single rule. There is no one single way to figure that out. It's just the fact that you used to grow fast and now you suddenly stagnate and you stop reducing the gap between you and advanced economies. And that's where Russia is now, that's where Kazakhstan is now. And in that paper, I actually, in that report, I actually referred to my paper with Philippe Aguillon and Kanchul-jo about Korea. South Korea is an example where it was actually approaching a middle income trap in the 1990s. If you look at the Korean growth, it was losing steam. Productivity growth actually came down to zero in the 1990s. And then it was a crisis, so-called Asian crisis, 97, 98, which actually forced Korea to go to IMF. And Korean reformers and the IMF agreed on a package of reforms. And Korean society accepted that. And the power of chaebols was broken because the model based on chaebols, which served Korea so well until this crisis, suddenly lost steam, exhausted its potential. Those pro-competitive, pro-growth reforms were implemented. Foreign investment was welcome. Certain chaebols were restructured or even closed. And Korea resumed growth. Productivity growth actually increased. And Korea has become this post-industrial knowledge-based economy that we know now. And that's the stellar example. Why I'm mentioning this paper where we show this is how it happened, because Philippe Aguillon is actually one of the leaders of this thinking even before the middle income trap was introduced. The concept of middle income trap was introduced. Recently, there was a big conference in Collège de France, where Philippe Aguillon is based now, celebrating 30 years of his first paper with Peter Howitt about creative destruction. Philippe and his co-authors also just published a book, of Power of Creative Destruction. And that's exactly the story that when you are moving from low income to middle income, you can invest, you can adopt technology from somebody else, you have cheap labor. So it's relatively clear how to grow from low income to middle income. But then after you reach middle income, you need innovation, you need competition, you need creative destruction. And for that, you need different institutions. You need to break the interest groups which benefited from the previous stage of economic growth, and you need new institutions. The problem is that often the pro-status quo groups, the chaebols in Korea or Russian oligarchs, are very happy with the status quo. They don't want to lose, and they, as you rightly said, become the brakes, become the barrier to further economic growth. And this is what we observe today in many countries in EBRD region. When I was in EBRD, we actually wrote a report called 8 Things You Need to Know About Middle Income Transition, exactly because many countries in the EBRD region were stuck in middle income trap. And since I already mentioned Russia and Kazakhstan, that's exactly a great example. Countries which have done very well until recently and now need a new model. And for that, they need more open political institutions. They need to fight corruption. They need to be more open to foreign investment. They need to diversify. They need to invest in human capital. And different countries do it in different ways, but there are many countries that actually need to do that.
Okay. Thank you, Sergei Maratович. I think the next question will be connected with your answers to this question. Let's talk about return of the big state, about statism. The pandemic gave rise to the trend that has matured for many years, probably since 2008 crisis, the return of the big state. Definitely, of course, statism at this moment was, as you told, it's a rainy day, and it was a response to an unprecedented pandemic crisis. At the same time, we see how in the United States, after Biden's victory, the state began to return to the economy, the unprecedented scale of social assistance and infrastructure investments for the country. Do you think that the United States will send the global trend? And you mentioned the creative destruction and the market economy, laissez-faire. So I think it's quite opposite paradigm to the large participation, big participation of the government in the economy. So what we see. So the question is, yeah.
Yeah, so I understand. I understand what the question is, and I would say yes, we see something completely unprecedented in the United States when President Biden rolls out 3 packages, each $2 billion, meaning each being like 10% of GDP. Of course, over several years, roughly speaking, about 5 years. Still, this is a lot of money. The first package is the rescue package, which is a normal counter-cyclical package. So this is something which was expected. Another package is the jobs package, and this is investment in infrastructure, which also includes investment in green infrastructure. And again, this is something that this is alongside the issues that I mentioned, in the sense that if you want to build foundations for inclusive growth, you need to provide support for the private sector as well. And for example, in the situation with the green economic transition, think of electric cars. Electric cars work really well if you have charging stations. We already have the infrastructure for the gasoline cars, but we don't have infrastructure for electric cars, and the investment in that makes perfect sense. However, as you rightly said, it's really increasing the size of the state. And the last element is the Families Act, American Families Act, which creates additional social support at the level we observe it in Europe, actually not as much as in Europe, but going in that direction. And that also helps to address the issue of inequality. America is a state where you have very rich people, but where you also have a lot of people who are behind their counterparts in Europe. And the turbulent political events of the last few years have shown that there is something wrong with American social contract, and this is what Mr. Biden wants to fix. Now, the big question is how we make sure that the engine of innovation and growth is not destroyed. Whatever we do, innovation growth is a private sector phenomenon. It may need support from the government, but we need to make sure that private sector has incentives and resources to innovate and grow. And so we'll see a big challenge. So with all these issues that I mentioned, the need to invest in human capital, the need to support families, the need to invest in infrastructure, I still think that if we want growth, we need freedom for entrepreneurs and for the private sector in general. And without growth, there'll be no social cohesion. Why? Because if there is no growth, we are just talking about zero-sum game. In order to give more to one family, you need to take more from the other family. The only way to have Pareto improvement, to move in the direction where everybody benefits from the social contract, you need not just inclusion, but also growth. And so that's going to be a major challenge. And whether, for example, today's United States will square this circle, I don't know. To what extent Europe will be able to do that, I don't know. I am worried about this issue, and you're right to ask this question. And also, I fully agree with you. We should worry about this issue.
Thank you, Sergei Maratович. We have the question quite similar in our Q&A box, so let me read it. The question is from our, I suppose, Georgian friends. Dr. Guriev, shall the development of CAMCA countries be left to the market forces with minimal government intervention, night-watchman, or there is a scope for government support for one, two, or several segments of economy, like it was done by many years ago, say in Japan or in South Korea?
So, in principle, indeed, in Japan and Korea, you can interpret what happened in the way of what's called narrow moving band, where you think that first you want to build, for example, shipbuilding industry. So you protect shipbuilding industry for 5 years, and then you remove protection and move it to a new industry like chemical industry, and then protect it for a while, remove protection, and then you protect electronics for a while, and then remove protection, and so on. And you can say that Japan and Korea have done that. There are two issues here. One is in order to actually have this program work, you need to be sure that in those 5 or 10 years, the domestic industry will actually catch up and become competitive with the removal of protection. So it has to be sufficiently innovative, sufficiently productive, sufficiently incentivized to actually catch up. And second, you need to make sure that the protected industry doesn't capture the political process. And that's unfortunately what we can observe in many CAMCA countries, where you have powerful oligarchs who get protection from the competition and then capture the political process, so this protection remains in place.
Capture the state.
State capture, exactly. Seize the state, seize the date, as World Bank and the BRD economists wrote 20 years ago using the first BEEPS data, the first enterprise survey data. And that is the vicious circle where government protects business and business captures the government to keep the protection in place. And you can imagine that if the state is not corrupt, you can follow Japanese Korean way. But overall, my recommendation is actually to move state spending towards from supporting businesses towards supporting human capital and infrastructure. It is a bit funny, but this is exactly what Washington Consensus would recommend. If you actually read Washington Consensus, it's not only privatize, liberalize, deregulate. It also includes issues like support protection of property rights, which people often forgot to do, which also, I guess, means establish rule of law and fight corruption. And then also don't subsidize business, but instead invest in human capital and infrastructure. And in that sense, I think this is probably a better recommendation. Whenever you support business, you distort a level playing field, and you have to be really strong, protected from lobbyism, protected from oligarchs, to make sure that you choose the potential winners correctly, which is much harder to do now, especially for middle-income countries, much easier to do for poorer countries. But then also the most important challenge is to be able to withstand pressure and remove protection.
Thank you, Sergei Maratович. So let's switch to the political issues. We have.
Let me follow up on this because the person who asked the question also asks, was it easy for Korea to choose the infant industries in 1953? So I would say that in Korea it was reasonably easy because Korea was a poor country, and in non-industrialized countries it's a bit easier to do because you can see what you need to invest first. You first invest in simpler industries like textile, then you invest in more and more sophisticated industries, and in principle there is a reasonably clear economic history argument how to go through this ladder in 1950s. Today it's much harder because of automation. It's much harder actually to figure out whether this sequence of industries is the same today as in 1950s. For example, a lot of businesses were moved from rich countries to poor countries because of low cost of labor. Now these businesses are re-onshored because of robots, because labor cost doesn't matter anymore because robots do.
Okay, thank you. Let's switch to the politics. So we have a high level of the geopolitical confrontation along the line of the US, China, Russia, West, conflicts in the region, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Armenia, Russia and Ukraine, Belarus. So what scenario do you think that these confrontations can develop, and what risks or maybe opportunities it creates for the countries of CAMCA region?
So it's, I think risks are huge. We saw a hot war last year in Caucasus, and these risks are always present. We saw concentration of Russian troops at Ukrainian border just a few months ago. So this is really dangerous game. And overall, what I would say is we are now living in highly uncertain times. It is clear that United States treats China as a rival. It's not Cold War, in the sense that China is so much more integrated into global economy than Soviet Union ever was, yet it represents an alternative which the West rejects. And China also doesn't want to become part of the West either and play by the Western rules as well. So there will be a rivalry. Russia is an important problem for the US, but it's a second problem. In Europe, the situation is actually opposite. So Europe is much more worried about Russia than about China. And so the North Atlantic partnership, transatlantic partnership, needs somehow to figure out how to approach these somewhat different goals. Now, I should remind you that European Union invests more and more resources in thinking about dealing with Russia. And a few years ago, they put together five principles, so-called Mogherini 5 principles for EU-Russia relationship. Literally last week, these were complemented by Josep Borrell's paper on 3 actions, which are really related to those 5 principles, being deter, push back, contain, and engage on issues where EU and Russia have common interests. The 5 principles actually include be more active in Russia's neighborhood and EU neighborhood, which not only includes Eastern Partnership, but also Central Asia. Europe understands that in order to contain Russia, Central Asia should see a reliable partner in Europe. And of course, in that sense, all countries in CAMCA region have potential for increasing cooperation with the European Union. Now, still, I would say that I won't really speculate much because there is so much uncertainty in here. What is clear now is there is growing transatlantic unity, on attitude to Russia, on relationship to Russia. And there is somewhat a divide on China. However, it is also clear that this unity between US and Europe can create more powerful West and can actually change China behavior as well. So, but yet CAMCA is at the crossroads geographically between China, Europe, and Africa, and in that sense, it's going to be a difficult couple of decades from now until this rivalry is somehow settled.
Okay, so let's move to the questions from our fellows. So the question from one anonymous fellow: the political regimes in Central Asia are significantly correlated with what's happening in Russia. Do you believe if President Putin leaves, changes will automatically occur in the medium run in Central Asia?
I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure as I would be, for example, in respect of Belarus. So if Mr. Putin leaves, the change of the regime in Belarus is much more likely. And with Central Asia, I think the regimes are very nimble. Even though you can see that same people are in power for decades, you also see how skillful they are, much more skillful than Mr. Lukashenko. And in that sense, I'm not really sure. And again, one thing which countries in Central Asia do, they don't do what Russia does or Belarus does. They don't reach out across borders, not too much at least. Sometimes you see corrupt money entering the West, and there'll be a lot of pushback against that. But at least Central Asian countries generally don't kill people outside of their borders. Again, there are some exceptions, and I won't really say things are very easy, but still. And the other thing is, of course, there is a lot of sympathy for being neighbors to countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, and so there'll always be support from Russia, whatever happens with Russian regime. So whether Mr. Putin is in power or somebody opposite of Mr. Putin is in power, Russia will continue supporting stability of Central Asia simply to prevent them falling into instability and chaos. And that is the cause which will be supported by the West as well. Because again, in the Western interest, it is that Central Asia remains stable, which means that if there is leadership that provides economic growth and security, that may per se lead to sufficient support from the West and from Russia, even if this regime is not fully democratic. So these are the issues which we saw in the North Africa and Middle East until Arab Spring, where some non-democratic leaders were fully supported by the West as long as they provided security. But then these regimes lost their power to contain the dissatisfaction from within. And so this is the main risk. It's not whether Mr. Putin is or is not there. The main risk is whether these countries provide enough jobs to young people, and whether they bring back people who left to Moscow or other Russian cities for temporary work.
Mm-hmm. Integration in CAMCA region is a big dream of Dr. Starr and his vision. Do you believe in the possibility of effective economic or political integration in CAMCA region, and how do you assess the current efficiency of the Eurasian Economic Union and its future?
So I think every regional integration project should be tried and pursued. So one of the problems with the Eurasian Economic Union is it's not actually a multilateral organization. It is dominated by one country. If it goes big, becomes bigger, and it is less dominated by one country, Russia, then it may become something like European Union. People think that Eurasian Economic Union is very similar to European Union, but the power of a European Union is that there is no one single country. Well, some people would say that there are two strong countries, and that's true in the sense that Franco-German agreement can push things forward now. But still, you need to get French and Germans to agree first. And even that is not necessarily enough because you need to reach unanimity. And in Eurasian Economic Union, of course, situation is different as Russia is bigger than everybody else combined. And so that is a main challenge. Yet all reduction in barriers is good. Access to markets is great. And so I'm in favor of additional integration. But honestly, what we see in this region is the real integration happens through proximity to Europe, through joining free trade areas, European free trade area, through establishing DCFTA, deep and comprehensive free trade agreements with the European Union, which provides level playing field, not dominated by any single player. And so that may actually work. And geography is not destiny in that sense. Georgia doesn't have a border with the European Union, but Georgia joined DCFTA, and that can be done by any country in this region that wants to be part of the integrated space.
Okay. The question from fellows, true democracy and big techs, do they need each other?
So this is a great question, and I think we should be worried about big tech in a sense, not in a sense that they're too profitable and have too much monopoly power. I'm sure that regulators will figure that out. But I think we should worry about information bubbles. Initially, we thought that online media don't create echo chambers. So online media were not as polarized, were as polarized or as not polarized as offline media. But with the rise of social networks, social media, we see phenomena where people live in different realities. And you can live in your own silo and have very different view of mine, and we will never be able to agree because we use different sources and so on. And that creates polarization. There are now rigorous studies that show that social media result in polarization. There are randomized controlled trials that show that people who switch off Facebook become less polarized. And this is, I think, the main challenge. And democracy cannot function if it doesn't have a center. In a polarized society, you have too much discontinuity when left come to power or right come to power. They need to be able to agree on things. And so far, we see that social media right now creates a machine of polarization, machine of outrage, rather than machine of connecting people and agreeing stuff. And this is something that we need to bring back to normal. And this is where big tech needs democracy. Hopefully, democratically elected policymakers will be able to find this solution. And if they don't, then this machine of creating polarization and conflict will destroy the big tech companies as well, because currently they are still seen by many people as a force for good, and that creates a lot of market value. Once they are viewed as producers of tobacco or weapons, then they will see their market capitalization going down. So in that sense, big tech needs regulation, and this regulation should be well thought through and hopefully proposed by democratic leaders.
Thank you. We have a couple of minutes left, and the last question, I think, does crypto matter when it comes to equality, democracy, and free trade? What is the future of crypto?
So this is a great question, which I don't know the answer to. So I think in the West, crypto serves no productive use, in the sense that it's an alternative means of payment, which is inefficient, volatile, and takes a lot of resources, including electricity. And it will be crowded out by digital central bank currencies or synthetic central bank digital currencies. However, in non-democratic countries, crypto serves a very important purpose of circumventing the big brother. And in that sense, the anonymous means of payment in non-democratic countries helps supporting democratic transition. And of course, it's very hard to square this circle. So in that sense, we probably in the West, globally, we should think about crypto as a non-bulky version of gold, an asset whose value is based on mutual belief in its value, and therefore susceptible to panic attacks, to runs, to volatility. And yet, in a free world, you can do that. Why not? But crypto will become less and less anonymous in the West because governments need money and they do not tolerate tax avoidance and financing of the gray economy by crypto enthusiasts. However, how that affects democracy activists in authoritarian regimes, it's hard to predict. So this is where I stand.
Сергей Маратович, on behalf of our entire network, let me sincerely say you thank you for your intellectual and educational activities. Perhaps you don't fully understand how much inspiration you give us by this, and we hope you will become a regular participant in our events. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rahim, for this very exciting conversation. Thanks for great questions.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you in the future.